The 31st of January 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon. Major Frank T. McCoy stood motionless beside an aircraft that should not have existed in such perfect condition. The tropical light shimmered across its aluminum skin, the heat rising from the runway making the bomber seem to waver like a mirage. It was a Mitsubishi G4M code named Betty by Allied Intelligence Tail number 763-12. 20 meters of polished metal, twin engines idle, wings stretching wide as if still yearning for flight. Yet what froze McCoy's breath was not its size, nor its silence, but what lay hidden beneath the inspection panels of its wings. Inside the shining airframe, he found fuel tanks as thin as drink cans bare, aluminum, unprotected, unsealed, exposed directly to the emptiness beyond the skin. No self-sealing rubber, no armor plate, no fire suppression system. Just thousands of liters of high-octane fuel waiting for a single spark. It defied everything Western engineers believed about survival in the air. Every instinct told McCoy that no Air Force would send men to war inside such a death trap. Yet this machine had carried Japan's hopes across half the Pacific. He photographed every detail, each click of the shutter echoing the same question. Why would a nation design a bomber that guaranteed its own destruction? The answer would not lie in this hangar alone, but in the long shadow stretching back to 1937, when Japan's Navy demanded an aircraft that could cross oceans and strike enemies who could not strike back. It was a design born of ambition, speed, and faith in range, faith purchased at the cost of protection. That faith had conquered the Philippines, sunk British battleships, and terrified defenders from Darwin to Rabaul. It had also condemned thousands of Japanese airmen to burn inside their own machines. The Betty was a marvel of mathematics and a monument to miscalculation, proof that performance without protection is an illusion bought with blood. In the stillness of Clark Field, McCoy's discovery marked the end of that illusion. The war that had begun with Betty bombers darkening the sky over the Philippines was ending with one of them standing abandoned, intact, and silent, a relic of a doctrine that had mistaken reach for victory. What made the Betty both the most advanced and the most tragic aircraft of the Pacific War? To answer that, we must follow its story from the design tables of Nagoya to the flaming skies of Guadalcanal, through triumph, sacrifice, and the fatal arithmetic that defined Japan's air power. In 1937, as Japan's empire stretched deeper into China and the Pacific, the Imperial Navy faced a problem that maps could no longer conceal. Distance. From Tokyo to Manila, from Formosa to Singapore, lay thousands of miles of open water. No bomber in existence could bridge those oceans, strike an enemy base, and return home. The Navy issued a requirement that bordered on the impossible: an aircraft capable of flying nearly 3,700 kilometers with a torpedo, or 800 kilograms of bombs, at a speed equal to the fastest fighters of its day. It would need to be light, long-legged, and relentless. And it would have to do all of this without the protection Western designers considered indispensable. The task fell to Mitsubishi's engineering division in Nagoya. The lead designer, Kiro Honjo, had studied in Germany at Junkers, where he absorbed European ideas about all-metal monocoque construction and aerodynamic purity. When he took over from Joji Hattori, Honjo understood the contradiction at the heart of the Navy's order. Protection adds weight, and weight kills range. Every kilogram of armor, every layer of rubber in a self-sealing fuel tank, meant fewer kilometers of reach. The Navy's requirements left no margin for compromise. The bomber had to fly farther than any in existence, or it would not be built at all. Honjo gathered a team of engineers and began a brutal exercise in subtraction. They weighed every rivet, every plate, every valve. They experimented with lighter alloys, thinner panels, and simplified systems. Armor plating around the crew compartments? Removed. Fire suppression? Eliminated. Self-sealing fuel tanks? Impossible. The mathematics were merciless. To achieve a range of more than 4,500 kilometers, the aircraft had to carry nearly 4,800 liters of fuel, each liter weighing 0.8 kilograms. The only way to lift that load and still meet performance requirements was to cut everything else. What emerged from their calculations was not a compromise, it was a philosophy. By October 1939, the prototype designated G4M made its first flight. The results stunned both engineers and admirals. The sleek, cigar-shaped fuselage and long tapered wings gave the bomber an elegance unseen in its class. It cruised faster than most twin-engine bombers in the world and could travel distances thought impossible for a land-based aircraft. The Navy christened it the Type 1 attack bomber. Within 2 years, it entered mass production, and pilots began to whisper that they were flying something ahead of its time, beautiful, fast, and fatally light. When war came in December 1941, the Betty proved its worth immediately. On December 8th, only hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M and 26 G3M bombers rose from bases on Formosa and headed for Clark Field in the Philippines. The sun stood high as they approached at 20,000 feet too high for American anti-aircraft fire to reach. At 12:35 p.m., they opened their bomb bays. Within 45 minutes, the airfield that had been the centerpiece of American air power in Asia lay in flames. 17 B-17 flying fortresses were parked wingtip to wingtip on the runways. 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter on the ground was reduced to wreckage. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few survivors, wrote later, "They came in perfect formation, high and untouchable. Then their fighters swept down like a storm and erased us. We never got a single plane airborne." I'm 10. 2 days later, the Betty struck again, this time against Britain's proudest naval formation in Asian waters, Force Z. On December 10th, 26 G4Ms joined older G3M Nell bombers in an assault that would rewrite naval warfare. Their targets, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse capital ships believed immune to air attack. Flying from bases in Indochina, the Betty crews approached at midday, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies like silver spears. The aircraft carried the new Type 91 torpedo, modified to run in shallow water. In less than 2 hours, the sky turned into a killing ground. The Prince of Wales took 6 torpedo hits. The Repulse took 4. Both ships capsized and sank before 2 p.m., taking more than 800 sailors with them. For the first time in history, battleships defending themselves at sea had been destroyed solely by aircraft. The message was unmistakable. Sea power had yielded to air power, and the instrument of that transformation was the Betty. Throughout early 1942, G4M formations appeared over every major front in the Pacific. They struck Darwin in Australia from 1,500 kilometers away, Port Moresby across New Guinea's mountains, and Allied convoys stretching between Java and the Solomons. They flew farther, carried more fuel, and demanded less runway than any Allied bomber in service. To many, it seemed Japan had mastered the art of reaching anywhere, anytime. American pilots began to speak of the Betty with a mix of awe and dread, an enemy that arrived from beyond the horizon, struck with surgical precision, and vanished before interception. But the very design that allowed such reach concealed a fatal truth. The G4M's wings held 8 vast fuel tanks unarmored, unsealed, and waiting to ignite. In the calm skies of early victories, that vulnerability remained hidden. No one yet understood that the same aircraft which had conquered Clark Field and sunk the Royal Navy's pride would, within a year, become the most flammable bomber in the world. The perfection of the Betty was already its prophecy. Japan had built the long arm it dreamed of, but the arm was hollow, fragile, and burning from within. In the first months of 1942, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty embodied Japan's soaring momentum. It was the long arm of an empire at its zenith, swift, precise, seemingly untouchable. Wherever Allied forces retreated, the Betty's shadow followed. From the oil fields of Borneo to the ports of Australia, its twin engines carried a promise. Japan could strike anywhere across the Pacific. The bomber's range gave commanders unprecedented strategic flexibility. Airfields that lay beyond the reach of Allied bombers could launch Betty formations that struck, vanished, and reappeared the next day from hundreds of miles away. For 6 months, the Betty was a phantom in Allied skies. It appeared in perfect formation at 20,000 feet, released its bombs or torpedoes, and turned for home before pursuit could even begin. American and British pilots who survived these early raids often described the same sensation, a feeling of helplessness. The Betty flew higher, faster, and farther than anything they could send against it. In those early days, its lack of armor seemed irrelevant. When no one could reach you, who needed protection? But war, like the machines that fight it, evolves. By mid-1942, the technological balance had begun to shift. New American fighters, the rugged F-4F Wildcat, the F-6F Hellcat, and eventually the F-4U Corsair entered combat in greater numbers. Radar coverage extended across the Solomon Islands, giving Allied squadrons early warning of incoming raids. And the tactics honed in the crucible of defeat, coordinated interceptions, diving attacks from altitude, team formations were now turning the tide. The Betty's invincibility was about to end. On the 8th of August 1942, the same date carved into the memory of every surviving Japanese airman, 23 G4 Ms from the 4th Air Group lifted off from Rabaul, Their mission was to strike the newly established American beachhead at Guadalcanal. The island had become the focal point of the Pacific War, a volcanic strip of land whose airfield Henderson Field would determine control of the South Pacific. The Bettys flew the 600 miles south at cruising altitude, confident in their training and in the reputation that had carried them from victory to victory. They never returned. As the formation approached Savo Island, radar stations on Guadalcanal detected them at long range. American F-4F Wildcats climbed to intercept. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. Within minutes, tracers stitched across the blue sky. One Betty erupted into a fireball, then another, then another. Pilots who survived the engagement recalled watching their comrades vanish in blossoms of flame. Out of 23 bombers, 18 were shot down. Approximately 120 Japanese airmen died in a single afternoon, the worst loss in the Betty's combat history. For the first time, American pilots understood their enemy's weakness. The Betty burned too easily. 2 or 3 rounds striking the wings or fuselage were enough to ignite its unprotected fuel tanks. The bomber that had once terrified defenders now acquired grim new nicknames: the Flying Cigar, the Zippo, the One-Shot Lighter. What had been an engineering marvel now became a symbol of fragility. Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn, who later commanded VF-17, remembered his first engagement against the Betty. "We couldn't believe how fast they went down, hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they exploded. We started hunting them deliberately. Every pilot knew a Betty meant an easy kill." From Rabaul to the Solomon Islands, this pattern repeated again and again. G4M formations that once struck unopposed were now intercepted, torn apart, and erased from the sky. The mathematical balance of range versus protection, the equation Honjo had solved on paper, was collapsing under the physics of combat. Speed and reach meant nothing when fire could consume the entire aircraft before it could release a single torpedo. Still, Japanese doctrine remained stubborn. Commanders continued to send Betty crews into daylight missions against well-defended targets, hoping courage would succeed where design could not. Losses mounted beyond all projections. Between August and November 1942, more than 100 Betty bombers were destroyed over Guadalcanal alone. Replacement crews were younger, less trained, and increasingly fatalistic. Veterans referred to each sortie as a one-way mission, all through one. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was beginning to understand the technical reason behind this vulnerability. Reports from wrecked aircraft recovered in Papua New Guinea revealed a shocking consistency. 8 large fuel tanks located directly in the thickest part of each wing, completely unarmored and unsealed. The structure that made the Betty so light also made it a floating fuel reservoir. Engineers noted that a hit anywhere along the wing route would puncture at least one tank. Fuel vapor mixed with oxygen, and the entire aircraft became a torch. Later, when intact, Bettys were captured and examined. Allied technicians estimated that each bomber carried nearly 5 tons of aviation fuel, separated from the open air by just 2 millimeters of aluminum. The Betty's design had achieved its intended perfection: light, fast, elegant, and that perfection had become its doom. What had once been a symbol of Japan's mastery of range now embodied the futility of ignoring survivability. The bomber that outran every interceptor in 1941 could no longer outrun progress itself. By late 1942, the myth of the invincible Betty had vanished. Its crews still took off in tight formations, still flew with discipline and courage, but they did so with the knowledge that a single tracer could turn their aircraft into a falling Sunday. The same wings that had carried Japan's empire outward were now burning it away, one mission at a time. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. Japan's momentum had slowed, and the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, once the sharpest spear of the empire's reach, now faced an enemy that understood both its strengths and its fatal weakness. The elegant lines that had once symbolized dominance now marked it as prey. Every flight was a gamble with physics and fate, a contest between range and survival, measured in minutes of burning fuel. The death of an admiral, the 18th of April, 1943. The turning point came with an event that fused intelligence, precision, and tragedy: the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor. American cryptanalysts had intercepted a Japanese naval message detailing the admiral's inspection flight from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. His transport, a G4M Betty, escorted by 60 fighters. The coded schedule listed exact times, altitudes, and routes, an opportunity too perfect to ignore. The U.S. Army Air Forces launched one of the most audacious missions of the war. 18 P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Guadalcanal, flying 400 miles at wave-top height to evade radar. Their timing had to be perfect. 1 minute, late or early, would mean missing the interception entirely. At 9:34 a.m., exactly on schedule, the P-38 seconds sighted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers flying low over the jungle canopy. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation, diving to attack. Barber's guns struck the lead bomber in the wing root, the exact point where the G4M's unprotected fuel tanks were housed. The aircraft erupted into fire instantly, crashing into the jungle below. The second Betty was also shot down, killing everyone aboard. Yamamoto's body was found the next day, burned but still seated upright, hand resting on his sword. The mission's precision astonished military planners worldwide. It demonstrated the power of Allied code-breaking, long-range navigation, and fighter coordination. Yet it also underscored something darker. The Betty's vulnerability had sealed not only its crew's fates, but the fate of Japan's most revered admiral. In a cruel symmetry, the very machine that had carried Japan to its early victories now carried its most important leader to his death. The technical autopsy. While the skies of Bougainville burned, Allied engineers continued their forensic study of captured Bettys. At Clark Field in January 1945, Major Frank T. McCoy and his Technical Air Intelligence Unit dissected tail number 763 to 12 piece by piece. What they found was as astonishing as it was horrifying. The bomber's wings held 8 fuel tanks, 4 on each side, arranged along the central spar where the wings joined the fuselage. This placement optimized weight distribution and fuel balance, but also turned the aircraft into a floating bomb. The aluminum skins separating the tanks from the outside air measured barely 2 millimeters thick. There was no rubberized, self-sealing compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression plumbing. Any hit from below or from the side would pierce a tank. Even a small caliber round could ignite vapor and trigger catastrophic combustion. American analysts calculated that removing protection systems had saved approximately 500 kilograms of weight per aircraft, enough to carry extra fuel and extend range by several hundred kilometers. But that saving translated directly into human cost. Combat records showed that over 90% of Bettys hit in the wing area exploded before their crews could bail out. There was no such thing as a damaged Betty, only ones that returned untouched and those that never returned at all. The engineers traced this fatal decision back to 1937, when the Japanese Navy's specifications demanded range above all else. The design was logical within those parameters. Japan's planners assumed surprise, limited opposition, and a short war. Within that worldview, crew survival seemed secondary. But the war that unfolded was neither short nor limited. It was total. And the mathematics that had once made sense now condemned thousands to death. The desperate modifications. By mid-1943, the losses had become unbearable even for Japan's command. Engineers tried to retrofit solutions without undoing the aircraft's delicate balance. Starting with the 663rd Production Unit, 30mm sheets of rubber were installed beneath the wing surfaces, a crude attempt at semi-sealing. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour and range by 300 kilometers, but survival rates barely improved. The rubber could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits, but failed entirely against the heavy 50 caliber and 20mm fire, now standard on Allied fighters. The next attempt came in October 1944 with the G4M Model 3. This variant finally incorporated true self-sealing tanks and additional crew armor. Yet physics again demanded a price. Fuel capacity dropped from 4,780 to 4,490 liters, cutting maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 compared to the original. Only 60 to 90 examples were built before the war ended. The change came too late and in too few numbers to alter history. The TAJ, missions 1945. Desperation breeds invention and tragedy. As Japan faced inevitable defeat, the Betty was assigned a new and dreadful role, mothership for suicide weapons. In March 1945, 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7HEA, a manned rocket-powered bomb, slung beneath its fuselage. The Ka, literally cherry blossom, was a weapon of pure fatalism, a 1,200-kilogram warhead with a pilot whose mission ended in explosion. The plan was grimly precise. The Bettys would approach American fleets off Okinawa, release their Okas at 20 kilometers, and turn away before interception. But the plan collapsed on contact with reality. The extra weight and drag from the attached Ka crippled the bomber's maneuverability. American radar detected the formation long before it neared release range. F-6F Hellcats from the carrier USS Hornet climbed to intercept. Within minutes, the sky filled with streaks of tracer fire. Every Betty in the formation was shot down. Not a single Ka reached its target. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 AHA pilots died without inflicting any damage. The sea was littered with debris and burning fuel, a floating memorial to a doctrine that could no longer pretend to logic. Collapse and reckoning. By the summer of 1945, the G4M existed only as a shadow of its former self. Allied bombing had crippled Japan's factories. Aviation fuel was scarce, spare parts non-existent. Yet production continued, as if inertia alone could resist defeat. By war's end, approximately 2,414 Bettys had been built across all models. Virtually none survived. The attrition rate exceeded 95%. The aircrews knew it. Veterans spoke of climbing into their bombers with the same resignation as men boarding lifeboats on a sinking ship. One surviving flight petty officer, Masuato Ko, later wrote, "The Betty was magnificent, but it asked us to die for its range. We flew because we were ordered to fly. We died because that was what it was designed to make us do." His words distilled the entire paradox of Japan's wartime engineering. The Betty was not a failure of technology, but a triumph of misguided purpose. It performed exactly as its creators intended, fast, far, and fatally. The tragedy was that those intentions belonged to a vision of war that no longer existed. In the end, the Betty's story returned to where it began. On the 19th of August, 1945, two white-painted G4 Miss bearing green crosses departed Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japan's surrender delegation to Iwo. The call signs were Baton 1 and Baton 2, a deliberate echo of America's 1,942 defeat. This time, the aircraft carried no bombs, no torpedoes, no dreams of victory, only emissaries of surrender. Escorted by American fighters, the White Bettys crossed the same skies they had once set ablaze. The circle was complete. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty had opened the Pacific War in triumph and closed it in silence. Its legacy was not merely technical but moral. It proved that design divorced from empathy, performance detached from protection, leads not to victory but to extinction. The gleaming fuselage that Major McCoy once photographed on the tarmac at Clark Field was more than an artifact. It was a mirror reflecting the price of ambition untempered by compassion. When Allied analysts completed their final reports on the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, they realized they had not simply studied an aircraft, they had uncovered a worldview. Every bolt, every fuel tank, every omission of armor revealed a philosophy of war that stood in stark contrast to their own. To the Japanese Navy of the late 1930s, a bomber was an instrument of reach. Its worth lay in the distance it could fly and the blow it could deliver. The crew were components of the weapon, not its purpose. Protection was a luxury that diluted performance. This belief shaped not only the Betty but also Japan's wider military doctrine. Initiative mattered more than endurance, and speed outweighed safety. The G4M embodied that logic perfectly. It could reach farther than any bomber in the world, but only once. In the United States, the same years produced a very different vision. American designers approached aircraft as extensions of human skill. Crews were assets trained, expensive, and irreplaceable in a long war. Machines could be rebuilt, veterans could not. This principle became known informally as the survivability doctrine. It guided every major bomber program from the B-17 Flying Fortress to the B-24 Liberator and the B-25 Mitchell. These aircraft were heavier, slower, and costlier than their Japanese counterparts, but they were designed to bring men home. The B-17, for example, carried nearly 1,000 kilograms of armor plating and fully self-sealing fuel tanks from the C model onward. The B-25 incorporated armored seats for the pilot and co-pilot, armored glass for the bombardier, and redundant fire suppression systems throughout the fuselage. Every additional kilogram was a conscious trade-off range and speed sacrificed for survival. The statistics vindicated that philosophy. U.S. Army Air Force's studies showed that body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities by more than 75%, while self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related deaths by similar margins. Aircraft that could survive damage and return to base preserved not only machines but experience. Each pilot who lived to fly another mission multiplied the effectiveness of his squadron. The cost and performance was measurable. The gain in human life was incalculable. The Betty's opposite path exposed the fragility of Japan's assumptions. The G4M's designers had wagered that wars would be short, enemies slow, and courage an adequate substitute for armor. In the early months of victory, that gamble seemed brilliant. But as the conflict stretched into years and technology accelerated, the equation inverted. The United States could produce more planes, more pilots, and more fuel than Japan could imagine. Japan's decision to treat its aircrews as expendable only hastened its defeat. This divergence went beyond engineering. It reflected two fundamentally different moral economies of war. American strategy sought sustainability, a system that could fight indefinitely without consuming itself. Japanese strategy sought decisiveness, a single overwhelming strike that would compel surrender. The Betty was built for that first strike, not for the long war that followed. The contrast was visible even in production numbers. Between 1,941 and 1,945, the United States built over 12,000 B-17 seconds and nearly 10,000 B-24 seconds, each one heavier and more complex than the G4M. Japan built roughly 2,400 Bettys, a fraction of that output, and lost nearly all of them. Industrial capacity, too, was a kind of protection. America's factories could replace losses faster than Japan could record them. Yet even amid the fire and statistics, the Betty forced the world to reconsider what air power truly meant. Its early triumph over Force Z, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, signaled the end of the battleship era and the dawn of air supremacy at sea. It proved that an aircraft, not a fleet, could decide a nation's fate. That truth reshaped global strategy forever. The carrier and the long-range bomber became the new kings of warfare. But the same story carried a second lesson, one less glamorous and far more human. The Betty's destruction revealed that technological brilliance without regard for survivability is self-defeating. The aircraft that could fly 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when it could not survive the last 100. Range and speed, unbalanced by protection, became liabilities rather than strengths. American designers took that lesson to heart. In the final years of the war, the B-29 Superfortress integrated both philosophies, performance, and protection, achieving range, altitude, and survivability in a single design. Its crews crossed the same Pacific that had consumed the Bettys, but they came home. The difference lay not in technology alone, but in the belief that endurance, not sacrifice, defines victory. Globally, the G4M story reverberated far beyond Japan. It became a case study in military academies, an example cited in engineering manuals and ethics discussions alike. Western engineers saw in it the warning that efficiency taken to an extreme becomes fragility. Strategists saw the proof that the value of life in design decisions can determine the outcome of wars. The Betty had once demonstrated the supremacy of air power. By its destruction, it demonstrated the supremacy of empathy in design. Its wings carried not only bombs and fuel, but the weight of a national philosophy, and that philosophy, unprotected, burned away in the Pacific sky. On the 19th of August, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito's radio address announced Japan's surrender, two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers lifted off from Atsugi Airfield. Their olive green paint had been covered with white, their red rising sun insignia replaced by green crosses. The aircraft carried no bombs, no torpedoes, no illusions of victory, only Japan's surrender delegation bound for the American base at Iwo. Their call signs were Baton 1 and Baton 2, a deliberate echo of America's humiliation in 1942, now reversed. Escorting them were U.S. P-38 Lightnings, the same type of fighter that had brought down Admiral Yamamoto 2 years earlier. As the White Bettys flew over the Pacific, they crossed invisible lines of history. The same design that had symbolized Japan's reach in 1941 now carried the symbols of its defeat. The bomber's unarmored fuselages gleamed in the sun, silent witnesses to a truth both nations understood by then. Power without protection cannot endure. When the Japanese envoys stepped off those planes and onto the tarmac, the circle that had begun at Clark Field nearly 4 years earlier finally closed. The Betty's life had traced the entire arc of Japan's war, its ambition, brilliance, tragedy, and surrender. It began as an embodiment of technological triumph, the most advanced land-based bomber of its time. It ended as a white flag with wings. The irony was almost poetic. The same sleek fuselage that had carried destruction across oceans now ferried the documents of peace. In the post-war years, as engineers and historians dissected the G4M's remains, they found in its thin aluminum skin a mirror rather than a relic. The Betty forced the aviation world to confront uncomfortable questions. What is the purpose of innovation? How much risk is acceptable in the name of performance? Where, between efficiency and humanity, should a designer draw the line? The answers shaped the future of aviation. Every bomber and transport built after 1945 carried some trace of the lessons learned from the G4M's demise. The B-29 Superfortress and later the B-52 Stratofortress balanced endurance and protection. integrating pressurized cabins, armor, and redundant systems that could sustain battle damage and bring their crews home. The concept of survivability became not just a technical specification, but a moral one, an acknowledgement that machines serve people, not the reverse. In military academies around the world, the Betty became a case study in the cost of doctrinal rigidity. It showed how a design optimized for a specific vision of war can become obsolete the moment that vision collapses. Japan's planners in 1937 had imagined a series of short, decisive conflicts fought on their terms. What they got was a grinding industrial war fought on America's terms. The Betty, born for the former, could not survive the latter. Yet to reduce it only to a symbol of failure would be unjust. The G4M was, in its way, a masterpiece. It pushed the limits of aerodynamics, materials, science, and range long before radar navigation and jet propulsion existed. Its designers achieved what they were asked to achieve. They did not miscalculate the equations, they misjudged the future. That distinction is what makes the Betty's story universal. Every generation of engineers faces the same temptation: to chase performance at any cost, to mistake capability for wisdom. The thin line between brilliance and catastrophe is measured not in technology but in foresight. The G4M crossed that line with beauty and precision and paid for it in blood and fire. When Major Frank T. McCoy photographed the abandoned Betty at Clark Field in January 1945, he could not have known that he was documenting more than an aircraft. He was recording a philosophy's final form: polished aluminum stretched over empty air. The missing armor, the unsealed tanks, the lack of redundancy, each absence spoke louder than any engine. They were absences of mercy, of caution, of time. Today, a handful of corroded fuselage sections remain in museums, fragments of what was once the pride of Japan's skies. Tourists walk past them without realizing that these twisted panels once carried both triumph and tragedy. But those who pause, who look closely, can still see reflections of sunlight in the metal and imagine the sound of twin engines fading into the horizon. The beauty remains, and so does the lesson. The Betty's legacy is not about speed, range, or even war. It is about balance, the eternal negotiation between what we can do and what we should do. The aircraft that opened the Pacific War by annihilating American air power ended it by surrendering in peace colors. It is a perfect parabola, proof that the extremes of ambition eventually curve back into humility. In the end, the Betty was not a failed machine. It was a faithful servant of flawed ideas. It did exactly what it was built to do, and that is precisely why it burned. Performance without protection, power without endurance, victory without humanity. These are the equations that doomed it, and that, perhaps, still haunt the engineers of every age.